Thank you.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so great. Yeah, so I'll be talking today about this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and touching upon its implications to the international ocean governance. Of course, there's so much to talk that I had to restrict myself to a few specific elements of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. But I'm always passionate about this theme and always, happy to discuss further other targets that I won't be mentioning here today because of time constraints. So just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today, just looking back to provide some background on the CBD, the Conventional Biological Diversity goals and objectives, looking into some of the Aichi Biodiversity Targets that were adopted back in 2010 that just expired in 2020, namely the fisheries one, the one that's with respect to climate change effects on the marine environment, and the marine protected areas one. We'll then also look into the progress of achieving the Aichi target. So that was in relation to the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the 5th edition of that report that was released in the end of last year, assessing the progress of the Aichi targets, and then look into the state of play of the current negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is still under negotiation and for adoption in October this year. But let's see if it goes ahead with the COVID situation, but I'll explain that. And finally, look into the relevance of this new framework for ocean governance more broadly. So first of all, just to provide a little bit of background and context, the Conventional Biological Diversity, as I'm sure that you know, was adopted in 1992 in Rio at the Rio Conference, the Earth Summit. And it's, it has 3 main objectives: conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, and also equitable and benefit sharing related to genetic resources. The convention applies to terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So it's important for the marine ecosystems as well, and to oceans in general. Of course, there are caveats to its application with respect to the marine environment. It doesn't apply, for example, to components of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So, for example, marine genetic resources of areas beyond national jurisdiction is not covered by the CBD, but conservation, it does cover, it applies to activities and processes in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there's a lot of debate about that and a lot of political discussion sometimes at the CBD, at the Conference of the Parties, on whether or not it's applicable to areas beyond national jurisdiction. But from a legal standpoint, it is. There's some political disagreements with respect to that, but based on the text of the convention, it does with respect to activities and processes. And a lot of good work has been done with respect to those areas. But also, of course, it does apply to components of marine biodiversity and to activities and processes as well in areas within national jurisdiction. So why we are looking at the past goals and targets, because they're very influential in a way. The strategic plan for biodiversity that covered the period of 2011 to 2020 and its Aichi biodiversity targets were adopted in 2010 at COP10 in Nagoya in Japan. And it was, it adopted this vision, the vision that by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential to all people. And this vision still is in place. Of course, it's a vision to be achieved by 2050. So it's still very important, even in the negotiations of this current, this next framework that will replace the Aichi biodiversity targets. And some of those Aichi biodiversity targets have been very influential in achieving progress in terms of biodiversity conservation. So we'll look at them a little bit just to contextualize where the next round of negotiations are going with respect to them. So some of those targets, the ones that we're going to focus here today. So target 6, a specific target on fisheries that called for that by 2020, all fish and invertebrate stocks and aquatic plants are managed and harvested sustainably, legally, and applying ecosystem-based approaches so that overfishing is avoided, recovery plans and measures are in place for all depleted species. Fisheries have no significant adverse impacts on threatened species and vulnerable ecosystems, and the impacts of fisheries on stocks, species, and ecosystems are within safe ecological limits. You need to take a deep breath before reading the sentence. It's quite long, but it contains all the elements that have been previously adopted by multiple policy and legal instruments under the FAO. So for example, the Code of Conduct for Sustainable Fisheries. It contains elements of that reflect the UN General Assembly resolutions on avoidance of significant adverse impact on vulnerable marine ecosystems, for example. It contains responsibilities of states with respect to conservation, sustainable use of living marine resources that's aligned with the Law of the Sea Convention and also with the Fish Stocks Agreement, which is an implementing agreement of the Law of the Sea Convention. So it contains a number of elements, and it talks about the ecosystem-based approach, and the actual term that FAO uses is the ecosystem approach of fisheries, which also has extensive guidelines for its application. Of course, it differs from region to region and from country to country, and it's not completely implemented. And you can see here on the bottom of the screen, the status of implementation of this target. We'll come back to it when we talk about the Global Biodiversity Outlook that review the progress of targets. But what it means is that certain elements of this target has made some progress, which is the yellow one. So the status of the stocks might have not been deteriorated since 2011, but other elements in terms of impacts on habitats and achieving that safe ecological limit has not made progress at all. So this target wasn't fully implemented at the global level. We're talking at the global level, not at individual countries, but you can see that there's not enough progress. The other target that I would like to call your attention to is target 10, which stated that by 2015, the multiple anthropogenic pressures on coral reefs and other vulnerable ecosystems impacted by climate change or ocean acidification are minimized so as to maintain the integrity and functioning. It's an important target, and it had a very short deadline, so 2015. And remember, the target was adopted in 2010. In 2015, the COP, the Conference of the Parties, reviewed the implementation of the target, and parties expressed high concern about the fact that the target hasn't been achieved. So GBO5 reviewed its implementation in 2020, so in September when it was released, the report, and it looked at the fact that it wasn't achieved by 2015, but it was also not achieved by 2020. In actual fact, those scholars demonstrate that actually we're moving away from achieving the target, which is very concerning, especially for vulnerable ecosystems such as coral reefs. And we have seen evidence of that in the IPCC report as well on oceans and the cryosphere, and also the previous reports indicating the dire state of coral reefs in regards to climate change and ocean acidification. But other progress, in terms of implementation of this target, at first there is some of those targets are negotiated, and there's no further guidance for implementing them. The positive thing about this target is throughout this decade, 2011 to 2020, a number of different instruments, policy instruments, have been developed under the CBD and developed by scientists, by colleagues of ours. For example, Murray Roberts and Seb have been involved, Sebastian Hennig involved in the development of guidance, for example, in terms of implementing this target in cold water areas. There is also a plan for implementation of this target with respect to coral reefs, but still, despite the existence of those guidance, the target wasn't achieved. My point, my main message is that I think we need to really consider all those policy instruments and scientific reports that backed the policy instruments that have been developed under the CBD to take it forward to the next set of targets and goals that are being negotiated at the moment, because there is a lot of good guidance and a lot of good materials that shouldn't be simply forgotten and start from scratch. So we need to build on those targets and the materials and the guidance that have been developed to achieve those, to bring to the next implementation of the next set of targets and goals. Finally, Target 11, that's a very well-known Aichi Target 11, mostly focused on marine protected areas. But again, there was a new term that was introduced back in 2010 on other effective area-based conservation measures, what we call OECMs. And even that was a new term back in 2010. And the guidance for that, what does that mean? Definition and criteria for what other effective area-based conservation measures mean was only adopted by the CBD in 2018. So the reporting on this target with respect to OECMs have not been, as much as we could have hoped, because of course there is no guidance on implementing that. But what concerns me the most, this target has received the most success, the most progress of implementation amongst many of the Aichi biodiversity targets. But there is a lot of focus on the percentage, on the 10%. And this target, as we can see on the screen, there are a lot of qualitative elements that complement, that supplement, and it's, if not more important than the percentage itself. So it states that by 2020, at least 17% of the terrestrial and inland water and 10% of the coastal marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, are conserved through effectively and actively managed, ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, the OECMs, and integrated into wider landscapes and seascapes. So the qualitative elements of this target include, of course, you need to protect areas that are important for biodiversity and ecosystem services, not just any area that nobody has interested on, and just for achieving the 10% target. It also, that protection needs to be effective and equitably managed. So guidance has been developed later on, also in 2018, with respect to equitable governance of protected areas and OECMs. Effectiveness, there has been discussion, so in COP 13 of the CBD, so the Conference of the Parties 13, parties have been encouraged to apply the green list, the green standards, the green list standards of IUCN to measure effectiveness. So there has been a little bit of that cross-referencing there in the decision itself, but the CBD itself hasn't developed effectiveness guidance per se, but there's a lot of guidance out there on that. So by incorporation, by reference of those IUCN guidance that was made in 2016. ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas or marine protected areas. COP, the Conference of the Parties 9, back in 2008, has also developed guidance on what ecologically representative MPA networks should be, and how they also developed steps for implementing those networks of MPAs. And then, of course, COP 14, 2018, also developed further guidance on integration into wider landscapes and seascapes, putting a lot of emphasis on connectivity, for example. And of course, there is the connectivity element of this target, which is also very important, and we can draw a lot of guidance for that, reference to the Convention on Migratory Species that has been produced a lot of good material also in decisions and resolutions with respect to ecological connectivity. So there is guidance out there, but it's a shame that there's so much emphasis on the 10% and achieving the 10% that a lot of these other elements fell through the cracks. So that's one, I think, message or important lesson learned for moving forward with the new targets as we negotiate them. So this is just, some of the conclusions of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the 5th edition of the report that was released last year. It concluded, unfortunately, that none of the Aichi targets were fully met. So there were 20 targets and none of them have been fully met. So we're just focusing here on those 3 targets because of lack of time, but also those are very relevant to the marine environment. Not all of the Aichi biodiversity targets are, relevant to the marine environment. There are others that are as well, but we are focusing here for the purpose of this discussion today on these 3, but regardless, none of them have been fully met. Many examples of success in applying those, in implementing these targets have been, highlighted in the report. So it concludes that, when you have the right policy in place, you can achieve progress. And it also pointed to the possible reduction and the reverse of biodiversity loss. It's possible. It's possible with those right policies in place, with the right approach for moving forward, for achieving the 2050 vision. It noted that it requires strong conservation and restoration action for addressing all the drivers of biodiversity loss, including sustainable consumption. And that's an element that the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has put a lot of attention on sustainable consumption. I've been participating in the negotiations of this new set of goals and targets, and it's happening as we speak now, online, virtually, because of COVID. And there has been, a number of concerns by parties that actually we also need to look at the production side of things, to be also aligned with the SDG 12, which talks about responsible production, because we can't put all the onus on the consumer only, but we need to look into production, sustainable patterns of production as well. But it concludes the GBO5 that time for action is now. We're running out of time and we need to act now. And it provides some lessons for this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So today I just wanted to reflect on some of those, share some of my own thoughts, and have a discussion with you all on those. So just to share, so there is lots we can we can discuss about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. There are a set of goals to be achieved by 2050. I'm focusing here on the targets, again, because we don't have much time, but in some of the targets only, not all of the targets. And there are a number of other components of this framework. So there is the monitoring framework, part of the targets and the goals as well. There is a lot of discussion, and the discussions are ongoing as we speak. in negotiations with respect to indicators, headline indicators, contributing complementary indicators, who should be responsible for achieving those indicators, if the headline indicators for achieving those targets and goals should be achieved or implemented by all parties or just by developed countries, and maybe not ensuring that developing countries apply them as well. There has been a lot of plea for capacity building technology transfer to developing countries to be able to apply and to monitor and report on the headline indicators. There has been a lot of discussion on whether or not the complementary indicators, the contributory indicators, are not part of the headline indicators, should also be applied by all parties. There has been a lot of discussion on the baseline. When would be the baseline for this new global biodiversity framework? Should it be 2011, 2020, which was the decade that the Aichi targets were established, or should it be pre-industrial era? There's a lot of brackets, square brackets on the text of these documents all around. And there are different processes for different processes and meetings negotiating different components of this global biodiversity framework. So it can be quite confusing at times, and also very convoluted, and especially in times of COVID, where travel restrictions had taken place. So there is no, SBSTA, so the subsidiary body on scientific and technical body of the CBD, has been taking place now online with very short notice. So its negotiations are ongoing online. It's going well, but it's very challenging with very limited time frame for a month and a half. So it's quite demanding of people's time as well, and very difficult to negotiate. We don't have the in the corridor situation where problems can be resolved, or some there's very limited time for contact groups when things get can't get agreement in plenary, and then you go to contact group. So it's been challenging. And apart from SBSTA and the subsidiary body on implementation, the SBI, that's happening over the course of this month and until mid-June, there's also the open-ended working group, the third meeting of the open-ended working group, that's looking into the negotiations of these goals and targets as well. So that was supposed to take place in August in Colombia, but we don't know if it's going to be going ahead or not yet. It will most likely be back-to-back to the COP, the Conference of the Parties, but there's still no decision. The Conference of the Parties is supposed to take place in October in China, but we still don't know the modalities, if it's going to be a full-on Conference of the Parties, or if it's going to be limited. There's still discussions around that, so we'll see. But the post-2020, what I wanted to focus here today is on this target 1 and 2. So just to draw a little bit of some of the parallels between these targets that are being negotiated and the Aichi biodiversity targets that we mentioned before. And those ones are more relevant to the marine ecosystems. Of course, there are others as well. There's one on pollution that would be applicable to marine ecosystems, but just for this talk, let's focus on these 3 targets, just to give you a flavor, and then happy to further discuss on the rest of the framework. So for target 1, it's quite interesting. They really talk about spatial planning. So you see in square brackets are still the numerical targets there to be resolved, but everything is under negotiation. So not only the bracketed text that is under review, but everything is under review. But the bracketed text is really where they're seeking input from SBSTA and from the subsidiary body on science to provide further input on that. Is that the right number? Should it be increased? So by 2030, 50% in brackets of land and sea areas globally are under spatial planning, addressing land, sea use change, retaining most of the existing intact and wilderness areas, and allow to restore X% of degraded freshwater, marine, and terrestrial natural ecosystems and connectivity among them. So I have a question for you. And so this is a poll, so just, yeah, you probably have that popped up in your screen, just out of curiosity and just to benefit from your, from your expertise as well. What do you think? Do you think that the proportion of oceans that should be under marine spatial planning, what should it be? And we'll see when, what the results say.
So we'll give people just a few more seconds to vote, and then we'll show the results.
Great. Okay, 43% think it should be 100%, 23%, 80%, 1350 or less than 50. Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's cool. What do I do, Hannah? Should I share the results? What should I click?
The audience have seen that. The audience have shared
great.
the results, so you can move on now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so then target 2. Target 2 is the protected area one again, and you can see that, of course, it applies to terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So by 2030, protect and conserve through well-connected connectivities there, an effective system of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So you can see that the OECMs are there again, at least 30%, so it went from 10% to at least 30% of the planet, with the focus on areas particularly important for biodiversity. So here we have a survey, and if you could put your answers in the chat box for this one, would be much appreciated. So which other qualitative elements may be missing from this target? You know, as we saw before, Aichi target 11 was very comprehensive. Of course, it was really focused on the 10%, which is similar to the SDG 14.5. But there's some, you know, there's not enough, you know, there's still a few elements that are missing. I think, in my opinion, I think the representativity is not here. And of course, you can look at, you know, we're looking into these targets in isolation from the indicators that are also being negotiated at the moment, but because they're negotiating it, you know, sometimes negotiating indicators without knowing what the final language of the target will be, which can be very complicated in a process like this, because ultimately, if we don't have the target, I think, in my opinion, that reflects a breadth of elements that need to be considered, how we're going to have an indicator that has nothing to do with what the target is actually saying, how you're going to measure progress towards this target if some elements might be missing. So that's why I asked this question, if there are elements that may be missing. So yeah, so we can look at the chat. Yeah, great, well-managed, representative, connectivity, fisheries. Fisheries, interesting. The percentage of these areas which are generally managed, yeah, areas which are recovering, yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think, you know, everything should be effectively managed. I think there's no point in having a marine protected area or an OECM if they're not effectively managed. So that needs to be applicable to all of those. Climate change resilience needs to be considered. Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, more and more we look at the impacts of climate change, and also the solutions that the oceans provide, and how to integrate that into climate smart marine protected areas network. So those are great points. Thank you. So moving on, conscious of the time, I always talk too much. Then draft target 7, I think it's a good, you know, it talks about climate change, but then By 2030, increase contributions to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction from nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches, ensuring resilience and minimizing any negative impacts on biodiversity. So this is an interesting one. There's a lot of debate about whether or not those targets should refer to nature-based solutions. As you can see, if you compare this target with Aichi Biodiversity Target 10 that talked about minimizing cumulative impacts on ecosystems that are vulnerable to climate change and ocean acidification, you can see that here there is a different phrasing. First of all, ocean acidification doesn't appear in the draft target, which to me is a reason for concern because it differs. There is a difference there between ocean acidification and climate change per se. Of course, they're related, but it's the CO2 component that creates ocean acidification. It could be interpreted in a different manner, and you know, in that sense, not necessarily will cover ocean acidification impact. So I think it should be very explicit in there, as Aichi Biodiversity Target was. Sorry, the reference to nature-based solutions is still controversial. Especially some countries have been disagreeing with that, and also some civil society organizations, rightly so, I think, call for the need to to have a definition and parameters on nature-based solutions, because otherwise it could be anything. Of course, there has been guidance developed by IUCN also on nature-based solutions, and there's some parameters around that. It shouldn't be something that undermines biodiversity, because even though it has nature in the name, it could be detrimental to biodiversity depending on the solution you're thinking of. And also, it shouldn't be a replacement for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, that's under the scope of the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, but still there is a relationship there. And also, we shouldn't undermine the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, especially if those, sometimes some of those solutions can be used to kick out people from their land or some of the uses. So we need to be really thought through. So some of those parameters, and I think of, this problem of whether or not to have, I personally think that nature-based solutions should be part of the target. But I think that there is a need to define and to have a parameter, to have criteria or minimum standards for what those nature-based solutions are. It doesn't need to be adopted at the same time. Actually, we're running out of time with COP coming up so fast, so I don't think it's feasible to expect that a definition and criteria would be negotiated in time for COP15. Of course, there could be a cross-reference to the existing definition and standards of IUCN, which would be faster, but CBD could also develop their own, especially as the monitoring of progress towards those targets progresses, but it shouldn't be left to a COP after COP16. I think COP16, which will be in 2 years from this COP, COP15. So CBD meets every 2 years through its conference of the parties. So it shouldn't be left so late that it's actually hard to implement this target, because we've seen that with the OECM's definition. That was a new term introduced and didn't have a definition and standards that hindered some of the implementation. So so there is a poll for you on, do you think that a definition of nature-based solutions is needed?
So we'll just give everyone a few more seconds for the voting, and then we'll share the results with everyone.
Wow, great. Very good. Thank you for that. Okay. There you go. So I think I can close that. And finally, so I'm running out of time. Post-2020 target 8. So this is an important target, and I see the value of it, but that's where fisheries has been discussed. So there's, as you can, as you recall, Aichi target 6 on fisheries was very comprehensive, had a number of elements, a number of things that need to be met. And as you can see from here, this one is very good. It's on the social side of things, and I think it needs to be there by 2030, ensure benefits including nutrition, food security, livelihoods, health, and well-being for people, especially for those the most vulnerable, through sustainable management of wild species of fauna and flora. At first, if you look at that, you think, well, but okay, you can see that sustainable management of wild species of fauna includes the fisheries component, but it's only looking at the proposed indicators that you can really see, okay, so they talk about what is the status of the fish stocks and how to measure progress against this target, that you really realize that, okay, so that's the fishery target. Of course, it's more than fisheries, and of course, it has a lot of other social components that need to be there. But there is criticism, and I'm one of them, to highlight that the fact that the Global Biodiversity Framework hasn't, met the standards of the Aichi target 6, at least. And in that respect, I ask you if you think that this target would benefit from for more explicit mentioning of sustainable fisheries. So,
Okay, we're going to show the results.
great. Yes, yeah, well, unanimous vote. Yeah, great. And then, so I guess it's an easy one. Yes, we all think it would benefit. So which element should be integrated? So if you could write that on the chat, please, that'd be great. Yeah, ecosystem approach to fisheries, understanding collateral habitat impacts. Yeah. And I really think that, having ecosystem approach to fisheries, it's so comprehensive. Yeah, co-management as well. The umbrella of ecosystem approach to fisheries cover a lot of those elements that are included in Aichi target 6 and refer to those concerns as well. So yeah, I think it would be a great addition indeed to have, even if it's just that, because it's just, if they want to be concise, don't want to be, as long as, and of course there is always an alternative to add another target, but I think the co-chairs of the open-ended working group negotiating this goals and targets are being quite, strict with respect to not adding too many more targets. Regenerative, restorative aquaculture, yeah. But we do not currently manage fisheries on the basis of the ecosystem approach. True, yeah, but I think we all agree we should go there, right? I don't know. I personally think we should be aiming for that. So it would be good to have that ambition there, at least, and then creating the enabling conditions for that to be achieved. Thank you. Okay, so here is just, just some thoughts of mine on how, once this framework is developed and adopted, let's say in October this year, or whenever it's adopted, there will be implications, I think, and good implications, and hopefully positive, if the targets and goals and the indicators are comprehensive enough, I think there'll be a number of complementarities there, and that's what I like to think about, the synergies across different instruments. There, of course, this framework will be a policy framework. It's not legally binding by any means, but similarly to the SDGs, they're not legally binding either. But I think they complement each other. A number of CBD COP decisions have actually alluded to the fact, and the GBO, the GBO5 has alluded to the fact that the biodiversity is important to the achievement of the Aichi targets as well. And the Aichi targets back in the days have been recognized also as enabling tool for the mainstreaming of biodiversity into the SDGs and for the implementation of the SDGs. I think that the current goals and targets are trying to cover a few more areas of socioeconomic aspects to really help achieve the SDGs, and they're also using some of the same indicators. But of course, I think a lot of more indicators and improvement to those need to be done as well, because in my personal opinion, the indicators for the SDGs, in not all cases, in a lot of cases, they fall short from being comprehensive enough for its implementation. But those are the policy frameworks. But that, of course, if we talk about nature-based solutions and refer to climate mitigation and adaptation and increasing resilience of ecosystems, that has also positive, I think, implications to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and its Paris Agreement. And it can help because there is a mandate also, the carbon sinks, including from marine ecosystems, are included in the mandate of the UNFCCC and in the Paris Agreement. And looking at examples of what Scotland actually has done in terms of its audit of blue carbon could be helpful in this sense, but we need a standardized method and metrics to achieve that, because otherwise, reporting can be quite, of course, there's different realities and there's a need for capacity building, and we can't expect all countries in the world to have the same level of reporting or understanding of their ecosystems. Therefore, the need for capacity building and also to work collaboratively towards those common goals. But there are also, I think, positive implications if we get these targets and goals right to the development of this new BBNJ agreement. So it's a treaty that's being negotiated under the UN General Assembly. It's an implementation agreement of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has as its objectives the conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And there are a number of elements of this new agreement that would have some interface with this new Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including on area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So if there is a target, that target of, at least 30%, let's say, and if it's comprehensive enough to include those qualitative elements, the BBNJ, once it's adopted, it's still under negotiation at the moment, and also having the same kind of challenges in terms of COVID and not being able to have negotiations in person at the moment. What would that mean, right? So they would have to find, and that was one of the findings of the GBO5 as well, is that the marine protected areas, even though there has been a lot of progress on the 10% in areas within national jurisdiction, that level hasn't been achieved in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the BBNJ agreement would then enable that to take place. But without that type of goal and target at the global level, something that triggers, that pushes for further implementation and for these other instruments to create the enabling mechanisms for the achievement of those targets, it's a mutual supportiveness, I think, relationship between those targets and others. Another area that I think that it's very important to build upon is the relationship with the Convention on Migratory Species. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of work on ecological connectivity going on there, a lot of work also on impact assessments, guidance for environmental impact assessments with respect to underwater noise that could pose a threat to some of those migratory species covered under the convention. So there's so much opportunity for linking those and making sure that this global biodiversity framework, actually, that's the intention. It's not just a CBD framework that's, you know, in silo from everything else, but also connected to this broader landscape of, you know, that seems fragmented, but it could provide kind of a glue for a lot of those things, including the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development that could contribute science to the achievement of those targets and goals as well, including the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration that could contribute to the achievement of those targets and goals as well. So there's a lot of synergies that I think would be possible, but I'll just stop here because of time, and I'm happy to take questions and further discuss with you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dani, for that really informative talk. And sorry to take you away from all those other discussions that I know are currently happening. It was an unfortunate clash of calendars, even though I have to say we got there first with you. We've had a series of questions already submitted in the Q&A. So anyone who's currently with us on this webinar on Zoom or on YouTube, then please type in a question that you want to ask Dani, and we're going to work through those questions in just a moment. I just want to highlight that this entire session has been recorded, so you'll be able to find the recording on the MASTS YouTube page later today if you want to share it or recap on anything that Dani has said as well. And we're going to jump straight into the Q&A, and we're going to take the first question, which came in right at the beginning of your presentation, Dani, from Colin, and it was when you were talking about the Aichi targets. And the question from them is, what is the definition of a healthy planet? And are we clear about what ecosystem services cover?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, I think that there is the UN Ocean Health Index, but I think that there is, in terms of a global agreement that defines those terms, no, there is not a definition that at least I'm aware of. And I think that's a great question, because it goes to, you know, to the core of what we're trying to define in terms of thresholds. What is actually a sustainable threshold? It relates a little bit to that last part of Aichi Biodiversity Target 6 that talks about safe ecological levels, and what does that mean? Of course, that was inspired by the EU directives and so on, but it's still in the context of fisheries. And there's some developments in that field by, you know, regional fisheries management organizations in the context of fisheries, at least, trying to determine the sustainable level at the ecosystem level. And there is also the planetary boundaries that's not really integrated into global agreements, but it's a framework that exists in terms of setting some of those boundaries. So there are lots of ideas out there, but nothing that really is integrated in a legally binding way. And I think that's one area that, you know, the BBNJ agreement could help, at least in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Again, we're splitting the ecosystems that don't know political boundaries, which is a shame, but that's how things are. But I think there is an opportunity there when we look into cumulative impacts, for example, and setting the thresholds for what a healthy ecosystem actually should be. And I think it needs to really be on a case-by-case basis, because there are differences across. But I forgot the second question, or the second point in that question, Hannah.
The second point in the very first question was, and are we clear about what ecosystem services cover?
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of work by the IPBES on that at the moment. So that's the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they've even, moved away a little bit from ecosystem services terminologies and talk more about nature contributions to people. So that, there is a framework there which feeds it's very close to the CBD, and CBD looks at those IPBES assessments in a very thorough way to inform their decisions as well. So I think that's where we can look for guidance.
Mm-hmm. So our next question is from Matt, and he is asking, as the Aichi targets have not been met, I am interested in your opinion that the targets have been influential. Could you please elaborate or give examples?
Yeah, I think the most influential one was the Aichi Target 11, that I think most people know what it was and what it meant, even though there's still, a lot of governments still focusing on the percentage, unfortunately, as I mentioned before. But I think they have been influential, and in that manner, at least in that target. And I think that maybe because that one, the Aichi Target 11, was so influential, there's so much focus now on measuring more the quantitative elements of things rather than the qualitative elements, because it's easier to measure and it's easier to implement. So I think we need a balance there in moving forward, but yeah, and not as influential as the SDGs, I would say, but at least in the biodiversity community, they have been, something that people have worked towards. There are a number of reasons, I think, that I hear about why they haven't been implemented fully, but I think as always, there's not even, not only a single answer for that, so multiple reasons.
Great, thank you, Dani. Our next question asks, what is your understanding of our implementation of the ecosystem-based approach in terms of management of fisheries? How far down the road are we?
Yeah, so I think we're very far down the road, but there has been guidance on that. So first of all, the ecosystem approach in general, there has been guidance from the CBD developed in the year 2000, and then further guidance in 2004. So it provides a number of principles where that it should adhere to, so parties would commit to that. Parties also understood the ecosystem approach, or understand the ecosystem approach to be a tool for balancing the three objectives of the convention: the conservation, the sustainable use, and the equity part of it. So it's quite I think it's a very comprehensive framework for achieving a number of different goals and targets and implementing agreements. I think, under those principles, there's a need to understand the capacity of an ecosystem, so you won't surpass the capacity of it to produce those services again. But also the recognition that people are part of the ecosystems, and there's a social, the need for social, stability and support for those to be part of this system as well. There are a number of components, and in terms of fisheries, FAO developed technical guidelines in 2003, and then in 2009 they had a supplement to that, looking to the human dimensions of the ecosystem approach. There has been progress in different regions. So the one that I'm more familiar with is in the Northwest Atlantic, where the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization has put in place a roadmap for ecosystem approach to fisheries. And the performance review, and so the scientists have been actually working very hard to develop that, looking to multi-species models, looking to trophic interactions, and looking also protecting habitats from significant adverse impacts from bottom fisheries, and looking into the distribution of quotas, looking at units, ecosystem units and productivity units that actually span across boundaries, and it becomes very political and complicated to implement because of that. and also establishing ceilings for total allowable catch at the ecosystem level, which of course would still consider the individual total allowable catch, but the premise that the precautionary approach would be part of it as well, and you wouldn't, the sum of the individual total allowable catches shouldn't surpass that capacity of the ecosystem as a whole to maintain itself. So that there's a lot of development on that, but the implementation lags behind, of course, for political reasons as well. And there has been, the positive thing, I think, that, the performance review from 2018 of NAFO has indicated that, said you have made so much progress on the science part of things. Now it's time to implement it. And managers and scientists are working together now to try to implement. So we'll see.
Great, thank you for that really in-depth answer, Dani. We're going to move on to the next question that says, although target 6 was admirable, there was basically minimal chance of success. In setting targets, should we be more realistic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's the tension, right? So how can we be realistic and ambitious at the same time for the change that we need to actually achieve sustainability, given the crisis that we are facing at all levels, from climate to biodiversity loss, and also the consequences of that to peoples and to livelihoods. I don't know. I don't have I think, to be fair, I think that, target 6 was very comprehensive, but as I mentioned, all of those elements have been included in previous frameworks. Code of Conduct from 1995, Law of the Sea from 1982, Fish Stocks Agreement from 1995. Of course, and then more recent UNJ resolutions, General Assembly resolutions on vulnerable marine ecosystems from 2006. But all of those elements have been addressed by previous instruments. And so I don't think that it's unrealistic to expect that those things can be achieved. But of course, it's always difficult to move forward on those grounds for multiple reasons again. So I don't think that that's super ambitious, to be fair. I think it's it's
optimistic, right, like that. We've got 3 questions left, which we're going to whiz through. The next question is from Tim, and basically he's highlighting that good management needs smart targets. One, on the other hand, do the targets sometimes actually perverse incentives as well, is something that he highlights in the question. And basically he goes on to say, many argue that the 10% goal has driven change, but has led a lot of paper parks. He thinks that only 40 out of the 16,000 MPAs have IUCN Green List accreditation. So how can this tool play a stronger role in helping the quality of marine protected area governance? And then he goes on to ask, what other mechanisms can drive solutions towards quality and not just quantity?
I think that's a great question. I totally agree. I think there's so much emphasis on the numerical target that inevitably what you end up with is paper parks. And the effectiveness is something that's really important. So there has been some effort by some negotiators, it's not a given yet, that, reference again to the green list. The IUCN green list should be included as an indicator of some form for the effectiveness side of the target. And yeah, so, and of course, those other guidance that exist that I mentioned on ecological representativity and all of that, even though you need smart targets, but the indicators, the monitoring framework could help that quite a lot if all of those qualitative targets are actually described, measured, or the guidelines that currently exist for each one of those qualitative targets can be explicitly there. So it gives actually guidance to the parties to implement that in a more comprehensive manner. So that's one way to do that. And there's so many different instruments under the CBD that can be used to achieve that. But of course, the effectiveness hasn't been really addressed by the CBD. And I think in terms of guidance, developing guidance has by others, as Tim mentioned, and I mentioned previously the IUCN guidelines, but I think there is more effort that could be put forward in developing or at least in incorporating by reference some of those into the CBD.
Fantastic. 2 questions left. So if anyone has any final questions that you want to ask Dani, please type them in now. We're going to go on to that second to last question that's in our Q&A box right now, which asks, the percentage depends on what it covers. 50. This is when we were doing the poll about how much we think ocean should be governed by that you ran earlier. So the percentage depends on what it covers. 50% of the ocean is a huge area. The impacts vary. What is your view on allocating priorities to areas that are most impacted, and what should these areas be?
Yeah, I'm not completely sure if I understand the question. So if it's with respect to the marine spatial planning area, which was that 50% that was in square brackets and so on, then I think there is, of course, there is no solution. I think 100% of the ocean should be sustainably managed. And that's something that has come up in the negotiations as well, but it hasn't made it to the targets yet. Of course, that putting it out there also creates the opportunity for others to say, for other negotiators to say, well, no, actually shouldn't be 100% sustainably managed. It should be 50%. So I think the sustainable management, to me, is more important than the spatial planning per se. I think spatial planning is a very good tool to achieve sustainable management and protection and conservation, but of course it depends on how it's done. It can be top down and it needs to be inclusive and transparent process and all of that. But I think that 100% sustainably managed is a given, and it's already an obligation under the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's already an obligation implicitly under the Law of the Sea Convention. So I wouldn't see that as it's just a target to promote implementation, to measure how states are doing with respect to that, rather than something that should be open to negotiation, because it's already an obligation. But spatial planning is a different thing. And I think if it's well used, again, as I said, then it could be more than 50% for sure. It could be 100% in my personal opinion, but it needs to be well done, and there are caveats to that. It can be rushed.
Excellent, thank you. And I hope that answers your question, Colin. We have one final question, and they say, many governments are claiming that a large proportion of their territory is under protection using OECMs. However, many OECMs do not confer strict protection. They simply recognize inherent value. How many quantitative indicators, such as 30 by 30, be reported on meaningful and implemented effectively? Before we answer that question, what is an OECM?
It's other effective area-based conservation measures. So it's included it was included in Target 11 alongside with protected areas and marine protected areas as well. It's still included in draft Target 2 of the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. So I believe it will remain in there. It's a very controversial topic because, of course, I think that especially when it was adopted back in 2010, that term, because it wasn't defined and there are no parameters for measuring what an OECM was, there is a lot of fear that I think that countries would be reporting on any measure that they had and saying this is an OECM, so that counts against the 10%. And that was but after that, 8 years after, the definition was established was adopted by the CBD, and criteria was created. So it needs to demonstrate that there is real positive conservation outcomes for biodiversity. It doesn't need to be an objective, the management measure, it needs to be area-based, but the area-based management measure doesn't necessarily need to be have the objective of conservation of biodiversity, but it needs to demonstrate that it provides a positive outcome on biodiversity conservation, which is sometimes very difficult to measure because it takes time for a positive outcome. And it's very strict. I think the criteria is very, very good. There are a number of also guidelines from IUCN being developed. And in fact, there is guidelines being developed by FAO at the moment. They had the mandate from the Committee on Fisheries in February to develop guidelines for fisheries related OECMs. So I've been involved in some of these discussions as well. And of course, there are fears from a lot of people that, you need to be very strict. So not everything is counted towards this 30% if it's agreed upon. And what kind of fisheries measures should actually be incorporated or accepted as OECMs. And there are many different caveats, a lot of challenges. We had a side event last week about that, and I can send the recording to you guys if you want to listen to. And there are many challenges, because of the temporal issue. It needs to be a long-term measure, but how long-term does it need to be? There's issues about benthic and pelagic coupling that needs to be addressed. If it's a measure that only covers the sea floor, what about the pelagic environment above? And but all of those things, those discussions also apply to marine protected areas in a way. So I think that there is a need to see those developments on OECMs as an opportunity, and the more involvement we get in the development of those guidelines and those great ideas that we just heard from so many of you getting incorporated into some of those guidelines, the stronger it will be to ensure that it's not just a paper reporting type of thing.
Excellent. Thank you for all those really great comprehensive answers, Dani. We have now reached the end of the Q&A, so I'd like to thank all our attendees who have stuck with us to the end. Apologies for slightly running over, but we had so many questions that we wanted to answer that we had to run over. So that leads me to say thank you very much, Dani, for being today's MASTS webinar speaker. For anyone who's still with us and you want to recap on anything that Dani has said, please check out the MASTS YouTube channel. There will be a recording of this talk there later today. So Dani, I'll let you get back to your negotiations. Have fun with that. And I hope everyone who's still with us that you can join us on some of our future webinars. The sign up the sign up link for the talks that we have happening in June has just been popped into the chat, so please check it out. And I'm just going to show the titles of those talks that are happening next month. So again, they are free. You can join as many as you like. They are at 1 p.m. every afternoon, and we're doing some in collaboration with EMBRC, and they include a couple of our rescheduled talks that we weren't able to bring to you in May and April. So if there's a talk here that you see that you like the look of, then please sign up. The sign up link is in the chat right now, and we hope that you can join us again soon. Thanks, Dani.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everyone.